Okay, let's talk about a moment in 2025 when the US and Japan were pushed right to the edge of a full-blown trade war. The deal that ultimately stopped it has been called two things: a diplomatic masterstroke and a complete and utter surrender. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack that high-stakes negotiation and figure out what was the true cost. So how can one deal be seen in two completely opposite ways? Was it a masterclass in crisis management, or was it a total strategic failure? Well, to even begin to answer that, we first have to understand the absolutely immense pressure Japan was under at the time.
You see, this whole story really kicks off with a massive shift in American trade policy. It was a change that basically challenged the foundation of the global economy and put Japan in an incredibly tough spot.
The thinking in the US at the time was, well, it was built on a really simple and politically powerful message. America was being taken advantage of. The main target? The bilateral trade deficit. And if your country had a surplus with the US, like Japan did, you were framed as playing an unfair game. All that economic nuance kind of went out the window. Direct confrontation was in.
And this wasn't just talk, you know? The threats were very specific and they were severe. First, there was this idea of a blanket 24% reciprocal tariff on, well, everything Japan sold to the US. And then a separate targeted 25% tariff on autos and auto parts, the absolute heart, the lifeblood of Japan's export economy.
And the stakes here, they weren't just some abstract economic numbers on a spreadsheet. For a single Japanese automaker, that 25% tariff would mean a loss of 100 million yen. That's nearly $1 million every single hour. This wasn't just a trade dispute. For them, it was an existential threat.
So this crisis basically sets the stage for a huge debate back in Japan, and you can really understand it by looking at two key figures. On one side, you have Ryosei Akazawa. He's the minister, the guy on the front lines, tasked with navigating this minefield and just stopping the catastrophe. And on the other side, you've got Yoichi Takahashi, a really sharp economist who saw the government's entire approach as just deeply, deeply flawed.
So, if you're Minister Akazawa, what do? You are facing this overwhelming threat, an economic cannon pointed right at you. Well, his team decided on a strategy of intense, really pragmatic engagement.
What he did was launch this just absolutely frantic diplomatic sprint. This timeline really shows you how urgent the whole thing was. We're talking multiple trips back and forth to Washington in just a few months, all for these high-stakes talks to pull the economy back from the brink.
And here's the result of that sprint. A pretty significant reduction, right? Those initial threats of 24% and 25%, they were both brought down to a single unified 15%. So if you're on the negotiating team, this looks like a huge win. They had stared into the abyss, and they managed to pull back.
And Akazawa himself, he had this powerful way of describing it. He said it was like threading a needle's eye. It wasn't about getting some perfect outcome. It was about navigating a situation that was almost impossible, just to avoid the absolute worst-case scenario. He framed that 15% deal not as a simple compromise, but as a hard-won victory against just overwhelming odds.
But, and this is a huge but, not everyone was celebrating. In fact, one very prominent critic painted a completely different and, frankly, much darker picture of the exact same deal.
The economist Yoichi Takahashi used this really powerful and provocative Japanese term, katsuage. It basically means a shakedown or extortion. He was arguing that this wasn't a negotiation between two equals at all. In his eyes, it was a complete capitulation to a bully.
Takahashi saw this whole deal as validating a really dangerous cycle. Here's how he broke it down. Step 1. The US makes an outrageous threat. Step 2. Japan offers up huge concessions. We're talking billions in investments, big purchases of US products, anything to make the problem go away. Step 3. The threat gets reduced, but, and this is the crucial part, a tariff still remains. So what's the final step? A terrible precedent gets set, teaching the US that this tactic works and basically inviting them to do it all over again.
For Takahashi, the real kicker, the fatal flaw in all of this, was the deal structure, or lack thereof. There was no legally binding treaty. It was all just based on a presidential order. And that meant the entire agreement was basically built on sand, totally vulnerable to being changed on a whim.
So this brings us to the central conflict of our story, right? Was this deal a brilliant tactical win that saved the day, or was it a massive strategic loss that just created bigger problems down the road?
Let's put these two views side by side, because this is where you can see how the exact same facts led to completely opposite conclusions. Akazawa's side saw the 15% tariff as a huge reduction that saved jobs. Takahashi saw it as accepting an illegitimate threat. Akazawa framed the $550 billion in investment as a smart move to strengthen the alliance. Takahashi called it a tribute you pay to an aggressor. And while Akazawa saw the lack of a formal treaty as a necessary evil to get a deal done quickly, Takahashi saw it as proof of the deal's fatal weakness.
So why are we still talking about this one negotiation from 2025? Well, because its implications go far, far beyond just tariffs on cars and steel.
You could argue this negotiation really changed the rules of the game. It introduced this coercive, shakedown dynamic into the US-Japan alliance. And by cutting a one-on-one deal, Japan sidestepped the World Trade Organization, the global referee that's supposed to settle these kinds of disputes. That move weakened the very rules-based system that had protected countries like Japan for decades. It really exposed a painful dilemma for so many countries today. Do you protect your short-term interests, or do you defend the long-term health of the global order?
And that really leaves us with a big, fundamental question at the heart of this whole story. In a world where the old rules seem to be breaking down, how do we tell the difference between a necessary, pragmatic compromise and a dangerous surrender? It's a question that, honestly, nations are still grappling with today.